This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is D.B. Cooper, the notorious Skyjacker, and I will be speaking with William Sullivan, who's written a book about it. It's been over 50 years since the most notorious skyjacking in American history. The man's name supposedly was Dan Cooper, more famously known as D.B. Cooper. There have been many, many books written about him, and I have one of those writers of one of those books. His name is William Sullivan. He wrote a novel about the D.B. Cooper incident. But before we get into that, let me just ask you, William, I like to let my guests introduce themselves. If you could give a little breakdown of who you are, what you've written, and what fascinates you about D.B. Cooper.
Well, I'm a fifth generation Oregonian. My father was the editor of a newspaper here in Oregon. I went to school in upstate New York at Cornell and studied creative writing. And then came back and started doing books about Oregon history, travel guides. I've written 24 books about Oregon and the history of the Pacific Northwest. But there are a few weird incidents in the history out here that just don't seem to fit into a regular textbook.
Yeah.
And one of them is like Bigfoot, the whole Sasquatch story. And another one is the Rajneeshis, when this guru from India brought thousands of people to build a city in the desert, and that went awry. And one of the strangest was D.B. Cooper, this guy who parachuted with almost $250,000 and got away with it. It's the only unsolved hijacking in the history of the FBI. And it started right here in Portland, Oregon, and who knows, may still be here, because they never did identify who this guy was. He stole the money and got away with it. It's like the perfect crime, or maybe not. Maybe he died. So there's been a lot of speculation, but you mentioned that a lot of books have been written about this. Well, that's not true. There have been almost no books written about this. There was one terrible movie and a couple of songs, and then lots of popular culture. But the novel that I've done is kind of one of the very, very few. It's called The Case of D.B. Cooper's Parachute. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, I did look up, and there's probably 3 or 4 pages worth of books, true crime type books. Maybe yours, maybe novel wise, but there's at least 2 or 3 dozen true crime books about him, and most of them probably reuse the same source material over and over and throw up their own theories. Let me just ask you. Let's talk about the actual incident first, and then we'll go on to your fictionalized account and how it differs and why for dramatic effect, etc. So would it be fair to say that the most likely real D.B. Cooper is probably not on the top 20 suspects list? That it's probably someone who isn't one of these people who's theorized. Would that be a fair statement, do you think?
That's absolutely true. They have fingerprints and DNA. These are not perfect. They're incomplete, but they have been sufficient, and lots of eyewitness accounts of him during the skyjacking. And they have absolutely ruled out everybody who either claims to be or know who D.B. Cooper is. There have been 1,000 people who claimed to know who he is or be him. And they've all been lying except for me. No, no, I'm a novelist. So I take all the facts and use them, everything that's known about the case in the book, but then spin off with fiction after that. But there have been several really interesting scams related to D.B. Cooper, people who made great being Cooper. And I'd like to talk about a couple of the most celebrated and erroneous hoaxes, if we have time.
Sure. Let me just, before we do that, let me just ask you, D.B. Cooper is one of the rare criminals that we don't really know about. The only other one at his level, name-wise or fame-wise, would probably be the Zodiac Killer. Of course, D.B. Cooper whatever you want to say, probably not the best thing to do to rip off such money and hijack a plane. But he, as far as we know, he wasn't a violent criminal, and he has, because of that, because he's not the Zodiac, he has taken on an almost Robin Hood like air of someone that people cheer for. The closest thing recently that one could ascribe to that was the killer Luigi Mangione, who killed that healthcare executive there. But again, he actually committed murder, whereas DB
Yeah.
Cooper is sort of just, he's the guy who did what everyone wants to do: get back at the man. I've got a grudge.
Yeah, that's right. D.B. Cooper didn't hurt anybody. He was polite. He stole money from an airline company that everybody hated. Uh, he got away with it. So he's not at all like the murderers and extortionists that did damage people and kill things and all that. No, he was the gentleman robber, like you say, the Robin Hood, and that is why I think he's become kind of a folk hero.
So let's talk about the actual crime for a few minutes here. So it's 1971. Man boards with two, from what I've heard, two bags. Oftentimes people have said it's only one, but the FBI said it was two. He sits in the back of the plane. It takes 20, 30 minutes to get going, but once they get off, he sort of politely calls over one of the stewardesses and says, I've got a bomb, blah, blah, blah. If you could take us through the rest of it.
Right. Well, he walked into the Portland International Airport and went up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter and paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. At that time, that was $18.53. I mean, and he wrote on the ticket that his name was, for the ticket, his name was Dan Cooper. A later reporter misidentified him as D.B. Cooper, and that stuck. But so then he did at the counter ask, "Is this a Boeing 727 with an aft staircase?" And they said, "Well, yes, but that's a pretty strange question, isn't it?" He knew his airplanes, and they took off. He was in the back seat, so he could keep an eye on everything going on in the cabin. He did have a black attaché case and a paper bag that he brought with him. And in those days, it was like getting on a bus. You could take a sword onto the plane if you wanted. Nobody cared. They didn't check bags or anything. That was all after D.B. Cooper that they started the TSA checks. That's all because of him. So he sat in the back row and handed a note to the stewardess who was sitting in the jump seat behind him. She assumed he was a lonely businessman who was giving his phone number. He had already ordered a bourbon with 7-Up from her. And when she dropped that note into her purse, thinking it was just a guy hitting on her, he turned around and said, "Miss, you'd better read that note. I have a bomb." And she opened up the note, and written in felt pen in block letters in his own handwriting said, "I have a bomb. I want you to sit next to me." So she sat next to him, and she said, "I'd like to see this bomb." So he opened up the attaché case and showed her what looked like 8 sticks of dynamite, 2 rows of 4 cylindrical things. It could have been construction paper, I don't know. And there were some wires and a rectangular battery attached to it. And he closed that up and said, "I don't want to hurt anybody. Here are my demands." So by 5 o'clock, I'd like $200,000 in negotiable US currency and 4 parachutes. And she relayed that to the captain, and off they went to Seattle.
So this you mentioned this was money from the airline company. So ergo, most likely, he had some kind of, as he said, a grudge uh, against the airline, or
Well, Lisa Brucklau, the flight attendant who sat next to him, specifically asked him, "Do you have some grudge against Northwest Orient?" And he laughed and said, "No, no, I just chose Northwest Orient because it was convenient, fitted my purposes, but I do have a grudge." And he wouldn't explain what.
so? How long they take off, then go from Portland to Seattle? That's probably a very short flight. It's only a couple of 100 miles, and they land in Seattle, and the FBI apparently must be waiting for. Or was it what? We didn't have Homeland Security in those days, so it was the FBI, I assume.
Yeah, yeah, they had to circle over the bay for 2 hours while the airlines got $200,000, and the FBI rounded up 4 parachutes. He wanted two main parachutes that go on your back and two reserve parachutes that go in the front. Um, and they figured the fact that he wanted two sets of parachutes could mean he was going to take a hostage. So this was actually smart because then they couldn't give him dummy parachutes and have him go kill himself.
Yeah.
Because he would take the hostage with him. Well, as it turned out, one of the parachutes was a dummy anyway, because they got the two parachutes from the main ones from a stunt pilot, and they're fine. But the two reserve ones they got from a skydiving school, and one of them was a demo, which was sewn together so wasn't going to work. It was easy to repack, but it was just for demonstration. But that was the reserve chute. So when they landed and they finally got all these money into the plane, and he had that flight attendant go out and bring the money in, and he checked it and said, "Okay, now I'll let the passengers go." And 36 passengers then got off. And he said, and they said, "Well, we got to refuel the plane. I don't know where you're going, but we're going to need more fuel." And so that took a while, and he got impatient. He did ask for a couple of dinners, not for himself, but for the flight crew. And they said, "Well, that was kind of you." But Lisa, sitting next to him, said, "You've only ordered 4 parachutes, and there's 5 of us left on the plane. Who doesn't get one?" And he laughed and said, "You'll be okay." So there's the two pilots, pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and then Lisa, the only flight attendant that's remaining on the plane. And they finally get refueled. And he says, "Okay, now we're taking off and we're going to Mexico, but not the usual way. We're going to fly as slowly as possible, 115 miles an hour, with the flaps down, the wheels down, as slow as you can go without stalling the plane. And look, we're going to fly under 10,000 feet." And the pilots are scratching their heads. Why would you do that? And then the flight engineer says, "Well, with all the flaps down, going that slow, we don't have enough fuel to get to Mexico. We're going to have to refuel along the way." And they had to argue about this for a while. And he says, "Well, okay, Reno. We'll stop in Reno and refuel there. But off we go." And so they take off, and they do have a little discussion about that back door. You see, the 727 was actually an unusual airplane. It had the two engines, one on each wing, and one engine up on the tail, kind of high. And then at the bottom of the tail, there is an aft staircase that can lower. And the idea there is if you landed in a place that didn't have stairs, some remote airport, and back in 1971, there were a lot of those. You could lower this staircase and get out. Well, he knew that you could lower that staircase in flight too. He talked about having the staircase lowered before they took off. And they said, "Nah, that's not safe." He said, "Well, okay, I'll have Lisa lower the staircase for me." And so they get in the air, and after a few minutes, he says, Lisa says, I don't want to do that. I'm afraid I'll be sucked out of the plane. And they talk about that. And the pilot said, well, we could tie her with a rope to a seat, and then she could open the door and not get sucked out of the plane. And Cooper didn't like that. And finally, he said, just go in the cabin. And all of you stay in the cabin, and I'll open the dang door myself. And so about, 15 minutes after taking off from Seattle, the crew in the cabin has a light go on in the cabin that says, danger, the back staircase has been opened. And the pilot goes on the intercom and says, Mr. Cooper, do you need any help? And his last word, his only communication was no. And 3 minutes later, the plane did a little bobble. The whole tail of the plane went up in the air briefly. And they later did a reconstruction of this and flew a similar plane and threw a 200-pound dummy out of the back of the plane, and it gave the same kind of bobble. So he had jumped out of the plane. And that was, according to the pilot, somewhere in the north of the suburbs of Portland. On their flight plan, which was Victor 23, it would have been somewhere near Mount St. Helens, between Mount St. Helens and the Columbia River. And that was the last of him. They flew on to Reno and left sparks all down the runway because this aft staircase was still lowered. And then, and they were worried about the bomb and all of that, but when it finally looked in the plane, and there was no bomb, there was no Cooper, there was no money. The two of the parachutes were gone, and all that he'd left was his clip-on tie on the seat and 8 cigarette butts. He smoked Raleighs and had chain smoked 8 of them on the flight in the armrest there. And that's the only physical evidence of D.B. Cooper, that clip-on tie with its tie clip, the 8 cigarette butts, and a hair that they found on the headrest.
So
that's it.
So let me ask you a few questions then. I had never heard that there actually had accidentally been a dummy chute out of the 4 of them. So there was 1 dummy chute and 3 usable chutes.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that so he took all 4 chutes with him when he jumped. What?
No, but he had 2, but he had cut one of. See, he'd asked for the money in a backpack.
Yeah.
And instead they gave it to him in a cloth bag. He said, "Wow." He complained to Lisa, "What am I supposed? I wanted a backpack." And so he had to jury rig a backpack, and he did that by cutting the parachute out of one of the reserve chutes. I'm not sure, but I think it was the dummy one. And using that case, that parachute case, as a backpack. We stuffed the money into that and then tied it around his waist. So there is a very important parachute case in that, which is ironically why I chose the title for my novel about him, The Case of D.B. Cooper's Parachute. Because the parachute has never been found, but the parachute case was actually a critical part of the case.
So it sounds like he was well versed enough in skydiving that he probably knew that was the dummy, and that's.
I'm not sure, but I think that's true. He obviously knew quite a bit about skydiving and a lot about the plane.
Yeah. And did any of the flight crew, other than the stewardess, actually see him, or they were told to stay up front?
They were told to stay up front. The 2 other stewardesses did get a little look at him, and there was 2 passengers that saw him too, and one of them was pretty well interrogated, and they looked at the police sketches later and said that the first sketch didn't look right, so they made a second sketch, and they said, no, that looks too mean. He looked like an average guy, Portland businessman in his 40s, just typical guy, business guy, wearing a suit and a clip-on tie. The third sketch, they said, yeah, that looks like him. And since then, they've showed him these people um, pictures of the wannabe hoax copycats, and they shake their heads no, that's not him. He's wrong height, wrong look. No, no, no. They never did. Uh,
So
find a person.
because this was 71, genetic stuff was not even in its infancy. It was probably sperm cell level, to use that. And I've seen and read a number of things that they threw out the cigarettes.
Yeah, well, DNA was not a thing back
Yeah.
then. So the Las Vegas police kept these 8 cigarette butts for a while and then disposed of them.
Mm.
And the hair that they got off the headrest, that also turned out to be thrown away. So all they had left was his tie and the tie clip. Well, in drinking those bourbons, he had dripped a little saliva onto the tie.
Mm.
And that DNA is still usable. That's not very good, but it's good enough to show that this is a very unusual guy. He apparently had no family. I mean, there's been no parents, sisters, brothers, children, anything who've stepped up and convincingly said, I've got the DNA that matches.
Yeah.
No, none of that. Maybe he didn't even have a driver's license. I mean, this guy just came out of nowhere and went back to nowhere.
Now I know in recent years some of these Ancestry.com and the 23 gene whatever the company is called, they sometimes cooperate with the authorities. Has anyone been able to isolate the saliva and then say, oh, we found a great grandson or something?
No, I really don't know about that, but I think the answer is no, not yet.
So about a decade later or less than a decade later, some of the money was found buried at the turn in a river, and people have speculated that this flew out, and he even if he survived, that he didn't get to the spoils of his victory, so to speak, were lost. How much money was found out of the 200K?
$5,800. Now the FBI had microfilmed, photographed all of the money before they gave it to him, so we know all of the serial numbers, and not one of those bills has been spent. I mean, they offered a reward of $25,000 for somebody who turned in a single one, and they caught close numbers, but no, not one. Okay, the only money from that ransom that turned up was 9 years after the hijacking. A boy who was on a picnic on the Columbia River bank near Vancouver, Washington, was scraping together sand for a fire to make a campfire on the beach. And he found these bundles, 3 bundles of 20s with their rubber bands still intact. And 2 of the bundles were $100 bills each. So that'd be $2,000 in a bundle. And then the third bundle only had 90 bills in it. Now, if you worked in a bank, and I have, you don't put 90 bills in a bundle. You put 100 in it. So 10 are missing. The only likely thing is that Cooper took them out himself. Maybe to have some cash. I mean, he offered tips to the stewardesses on the airplane. They refused, saying that there's a rule in Northwest Orient that they can't accept gratuities. And when he finally got all the money, the bundles in the plane, Lisa said, "Ooh, could I have one of those bundles?" He said, "Sure, here," and handed it to her. She said, "Oh, oops, I don't think I really can do that. We don't take tips." So nobody else had touched the money. So 10 bills were missing from that third bundle, and the way that the sand was, and the dredging in the river showed that it had been placed there, washed up, about 2 or so years after the hijacking, maybe 3 years after the hijacking. It could have washed down from the Washougal River, but not the Lewis River. That goes in downstream, so that wouldn't work. But the Washougal River area was the sort of place where they now think that he probably did land, which would be between Mount St. Helens and the Columbia River. And there's two theories here. You know, he buried some of the money, or he lost some of the money in falling, or he died and some of the money washed up. But all of these theories have problems because where's the rest?
Yeah.
We're missing, you know, $190,000. People have looked. I mean, they sent out 200 soldiers from the U.S. Army to comb that area and didn't find the parachute or the money or Cooper. And people have searched and searched and not found any trace of this guy or his parachute. You'd think even if he died and was hanging in a tree someplace, you would have found something. Nope, it's only this money in the riverbank.
Well, it would seem to me that I don't know how wide the river is there, but let's assume that he did fall into a body of water. The fact that nothing has found suggests to me that he probably survived and maybe walked off and then died later, maybe within 24 hours to 48 hours of shock or hypothermia or whatever. It just, because if he had died, like if he had impaled himself on a tree or something, the body, you know, there'd be a skeleton hanging there after 6 months after the.
That's right.
So it seems to me that, especially with as many people, there had to have been hundreds of people searching for him in a manhunt. A body would have been found within a certain area, unless he, you know, found a little cave, crawled into it, you know, to recover, and just expired there.
Well, he didn't fall into the river. The river is a mile wide where they found the money. So the Columbia River is a big river, but the state of the money suggested that it had been not in the water for the first year or two. So it wound up later in the river, probably. I don't know. I had to work around all of this stuff to come up with a plausible novel that retells the story and comes up with a conceivable way that all of these things could be explained.
So, William, let's switch gears and go from the real man, whoever that was, to your fictionalized account. So my first question is, do we get backstory? Did you fictionalize D.B. Cooper had some trauma when he was a child? Or do we start your book right, you know, just an hour before getting on the plane?
Well, what I've done is this book is set about 15, 20 years ago, and when Cooper would have been in his late 60s. Now he would be like 90 years old and probably dead for sure by now. But when I set the book, I have him writing his memoir, D.B. Cooper's memoir, and it's absolutely true until he jumps out of the plane with the money, and then we have to switch to fiction. And at that point, he admits that he's being blackmailed, that somebody has figured out, he's living in Portland in plain sight under a different name, but somebody's figured out he's D.B. Cooper, and they're blackmailing him, and it winds up involving the Russian mafia and voodoo donuts. So it gets a little crazy in my retelling of the book. But there's art thefts, and there's the Ukrainians and the Russian mafia, and they wind up in Grenada and going to Latvia to try to track down some of these Russian contacts and the KGB. So yeah, I get to have a little fun with this because, you know, it is a fun story. As I say, he didn't hurt anybody. He got away with it, kind of a folk hero. Everybody wanted him to escape. So as you said, to stick it to the man, the Northwest Orient, everybody hated them, and the insurance company paid off that, and people hated them even more. So it was like nobody really got hurt on this. So why not have the novel version go on in that same vein and have Cooper be clever and in trouble and hunted and have to escape again?
Yeah. So let me ask you, because given the title of your novel, and what year was the book released?
Oh, it's about 15 years ago.
Okay, so that's long before, just 2 or 3 years ago, there were two men who claimed that their uncle or relative had used the chute, and there's been back and forth, people debunking it, people supporting it. So it seems kind of prescient that you focused on that detail. What is the significance of the parachute in your book versus this real life kerfuffle of a couple of years ago?
Well, let's talk about those. See, my book came out in 2012. Let's talk about the two biggest conspiracy hoaxes.
Okay.
And one was about the time this book came out, um, and it was Marla Cooper of Sisters, Oregon, a small town in Central Oregon, who sold a story to the London Telegraph, of all places. I mean, no U.S. paper would buy this, but the London Telegraph announced that D.B. Cooper was in fact Marla Cooper's uncle, Lynn Cooper, who on Thanksgiving weekend of 1971 had gone out on an elk hunting trip. And at this point, Marla Cooper was an 8-year-old girl. She sees her uncle go out on an elk hunting trip and comes back after the weekend with a confused story, his clothes in disarray, and no elk. And this 8-year-old girl jumps to the conclusion that her uncle must have been hijacking an airplane. Well, those of us who live in Oregon know that there are other reasons why you might come back from an elk hunting trip with no elk, your clothes in disarray, and a confused story. And it has less to do with D.B. Cooper than with Jack Daniels. These guys go out there and get roaring drunk. They come back, and their 8-year-old niece makes up a lovely story, but the guy's name was Lynn Cooper. How clever would you be to use your real last name but change your first name? No, nothing about this guy matched. The whole story was completely bogus. So we can toss that one right out the window. Sorry, Marla, but it was not your uncle. The other story that came out just this last year was about Richard McCoy, and a book that was written in there about the real McCoy. They finally got it. And they have done several television documentaries about D.B. Cooper that always end the show by stamping solved, case solved at the end. And they're all lying, and especially the one about Richard McCoy. Do you want to hear that story?
Go ahead.
All right, so Richard McCoy was one of the copycats. There were 15, 20 of these in the year or two after D.B. Cooper did his famous jump. 15 or 20 other men hijacked airplanes, asked for parachutes and money. And one of them was this Richard McCoy, who had been a Green Beret in Vietnam. And he commandeered a plane out of the Denver airport, sent it to San Francisco, picked up $500,000 in cash and the parachutes, and then bailed out over Provo, Utah with the money, landed safely, but left a trail as so wide that they picked him up easily within 2 days and all the money. And they gave him a 45-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, but he broke out after 2 years by commandeering a garbage truck and driving it through the wall of the penitentiary. They tracked him down within a short time and killed him in a shootout. Okay, Richard McCoy is dead. His two children live in North Carolina. They announced last year that their father was in fact D.B. Cooper because they had his parachute. They'd found the real D.B. Cooper parachute. He'd left it at their home in North Carolina. All right, if you are D.B. Cooper, do you keep your parachute? I mean, you jump out of the plane, you've got the money. Do you keep that parachute as a memento and donate it to your children in North Carolina as a souvenir? No, you bury the parachute, you burn it, you do any, you get rid of the parachute for God's sake, and you keep the money. So there's nothing to that. And in addition, the fingerprints, the DNA, the size, everything. I'm sorry, but the Richard McCoy was not the real McCoy. So there you have two of the most famous hoaxes.
You know, it's interesting because everyone probably has seen one or two of the sketches of Dan Cooper, DB Cooper, and this is 1971, yeah, and he looks like a character from Mad Men, the TV show. I mean, you know, how many? It's you couldn't be a more generic looking human being if he tried. You know, middle aged white man, slick back hair, glasses or non glasses, whatever. No distinguishing features. I've read now. Maybe you can elucidate. I've read both accounts that some say he was on the fairer side skin wise, others say he had more olive skin, like he was Italian. Others have said his hair was thinning on top. You could see a little bald patch. Others have said no, it was slicked back and quite full. Do we have? Is there a consensus on which? You know which? I mean, I guess the stewardess, the main stewardess, Lucy, you said her name was.
Lisa.
Lisa, she would be the best to give the account. What was her account of him physically?
She did give a good account that matched had them revise the sketch and came up with something she thought was realistic. But she was hounded by reporters and publicity seekers and curiosity people so much that she retreated from the world and wound up in a Tibetan outpost in the hills behind Eugene, shut off from the world. I think this really ruined her life.
Well, but I mean, so let's also talk about Cooper and some of the other imposters. How many people have claimed to be DB Cooper, and did the FBI take just two or three of them seriously, or did they fully investigate all 97 imposters or whatever there was?
They investigated them all, and I can't discriminate how many were claimed to be DB Cooper or claimed to know, but I would say about 1,000 of leads of that sort, and they tracked them all down, discounted them all, and now have closed the case, but would reopen it if there was real solid evidence that came up. It's just at this point I don't think there will, and so now we're left with a charming story of the gentleman robber who didn't hurt anybody, kind of a folk hero, and it's the realm for fiction. Yeah. This is where you can have some fun with that story.
So I know it was still probably in its infancy with FBI profiling came probably 5-10 years later with people like David Berkowitz and Ted Bundy, these serial killers where they would try to get a profile. Did they ever try to backwards go back and try to build a psychological profile of Cooper? And what was it?
They did, and Ralph Himmelsbach, the FBI agent in charge of the case, was convinced that he was desperate for money and that...
and this is where you came up with the blackmail as the reason for that.
Well, yeah, that's true. But you had to have a good reason to be desperate for that kind of money, too. It wasn't just because you'd been gambling. He had to have a serious blackmail problem, which is why I tied it in with the KGB and the Russian mafia, and art theft, and some missing plans for a Saturn rocket. So, because all of that's possible. The other evidence that turned up fairly recently was on that tie that he left behind. The tie had been bought at a J.C. Penney store about 3 years earlier in 1968 or so. He could have got it at a thrift shop. I mean, it was a pretty standard tie. But when they did electron microscopy on the tie, they found traces of titanium and some other rare metals. Now, there's several ways that you could get that on the tie. You could have been somebody else's tie, and he got it at a thrift shop, or he could have worked at one of the high-tech industries here in Oregon. Teledyne Wah Chang does rare metals, and Tektronix does cathode ray tubes and things like that. Or he, or that could be a red herring. It could be just that a lot of ties have that stuff on them. I don't see that as a compelling proof that he worked at a titanium factory in Pennsylvania. But he did have knowledge of the aerospace industry, so he could have worked for Boeing. He must have had a job in Portland in some sort of tech industry, so that's what I have him. I have him working for Nike.
Yeah. So I mentioned how he had this Robin Hood-like status, and I'm trying to think of some other cases in that era. And what comes to mind is the escape from Alcatraz. Those guys were never caught. We don't know if they drowned. There are some intriguing photos that the two brothers, I think there were three that escaped, and that there's supposed to be four. One guy didn't make it. One guy, we don't know what happened. We assume he's dead. And as of maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the two brothers survived. But these were hardened criminals, so people aren't going to feel that kind of affection for that. He's not standing up to the man kind of thing. Of course, then there's the JFK case, and whatever you think of Oswald, whether he was involved with Ruby or the mob or this or that, he still killed someone, or he's the main suspect. And we know he killed a cop, at least, even if people disagree about JFK. So he's not in that same league. Then you have, I mentioned the images, and what also pops to mind is not the Will Smith movie, but the Men in Black phenomenon regarding UFOs. There, he looks with the glasses like a typical Man in Black, and then so it seems to me that one of the appeals about Cooper is his everymanness. That he could have been any one of, as I said, at that time, 40 million white males in between the age of 35 and 55, let's say, and his enigmatic statements about having a grudge, but not necessarily against them, the airline. How many people? I'm sure you've had jobs where 30 years later you say, that bastard I worked for back in the 80s, And so his story seems quite relatable, and this, I think, makes people want to root that he did make it, that he did get off. But what odds do you put that he made it? Whether he died, later of pancreatic cancer or whatnot, what odds do you give of him of having made it to the ground and escaping with the rest of the money that he didn't lose?
Well, it's hard to give odds like that, but I'd say half and half. Chance he died and half he lived. But the main thing is he wasn't a criminal. Ralph Himmelsbach was wrong about that. If he really had a criminal record, and they would have caught him long ago. Yeah. But no, he didn't even have a traffic ticket. This guy was clean and otherwise honest. As you say, pretty typical looking guy. And in 1971, the Vietnam War is winding down. People are protesting in the streets. There is a lot of anger about the system. And D.B. Cooper kind of crystallized some of that. So I was looking for other cases like this that I could write novels about, because I want to do a series of fun, not cozy mysteries. I mean, they're a little noir. I mean, there's a body count, probably a dozen people die in this book, but my novel, but still fairly cozy murder mysteries. And so I came up with two others, and I've done a series. The first one is called The Case of Einstein's Violin, and it's about a missing Einstein formula for quantum gravity. And that part's true. My son is an astrophysicist and said that Einstein really did throw away this formula for quantum gravity. It could be anywhere. So I have it turn up in an old violin case in an attic in Oregon, and it sets up a whole chain uh, of a mystery too. And then following the Cooper book, I have the case of the reborn Bhagwan, and this is about the Rajneeshis in Oregon, this Indian group from India that built a city in the desert in Oregon and wound up poisoning people and getting into all kinds of trouble.
I remember I think the Bhagwan was on Phil Donahue's show, if I recall.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Well, he died 26 years before I wrote my book,
Yeah.
but he always said he would be reincarnated. So the premise for the novel is that they now claim he has, and that he's actually a 26-year-old barista in a Portland coffee shop. So they start up the whole movement again, and people start dying, and my detective, who cracks the Cooper case, has to come in and figure out what's really going on. And so I'm having fun with Oregon history, playing up, as you say, stories about weird events and crimes. And I'm working on a fourth one, but it'll be a while. Anyway, I'm having a lot of fun with this, and the book is fun to read too, because it is a fun case and a rollicking adventure.
So just as we wind up, you had mentioned a bit earlier about the parachute and the two guys who claim that parachute didn't match the parameters of that was given to Cooper, correct?
No, it did.
Oh,
No,
it did?
it's the right kind of parachute. But there were a lot of parachutes like that.
Okay.
So, no.
And as
And
for
it is,
and
no,
as
no absolute proof that it was, no proof that it's part of that. And it's just silly. It's just ridiculous that Cooper would carry this parachute around with him and hide it in North Carolina.
yeah. Now that's since we seem to have been dealing with a relatively rational and reasonable person other than extortion. This wasn't like the Zodiac or some serial killer who's keeping a trophy of his victory over. It's not like he took some kind of symbol of that. So let's just pull back and just end here talking a little bit more about the real case there. You mentioned that there were 12.5 or more skyjackings. I remember as a kid, I was a kid then. That was all the rage in the early 70s. I remember I went on a class trip. One of my classmates' mother was a stewardess, and we just taxied around the runway, to give the kids a thrill. But so of all of the other skyjackers, Cooper was the only one that escaped. You said that the one imposter got into a shootout. Were there any other violent skyjackings where there were?
Yeah, there were. Yeah, there were a number of other violent skyjackings, and this is why they, after a year, they invented a Cooper vane, which is a device that would lock that aft door so you could not open it in flight. And they also started checking luggage and everything and the TSA. And you no longer are allowed to casually mention that as a joke that you have a bomb, because you'll be taken off that plane immediately. So all of that is as a result of Cooper. But most of the other copycats were hardened criminals or mentally ill. One of them hijacked a plane out of Seattle, demanded that they assassinate his boss and give him money, and they played along with him for a while. And then he said he wanted to be flown to Afghanistan, and they flew him to Portland, and as he got out of the plane, they shot him. So these are not happy stories of people who are sick or criminals, and D.B. Cooper was not. The stewardesses said that he was friendly, considerate, a gentleman, nice, not mean, not nasty, and generous. Uh, as you say, he really is kind of an everyman.
Yeah.
Maybe we have this all in us. You kind of hope we don't, but maybe we do. Somewhere down there, there's that monster inside that says, you could do this. You could pull off the perfect crime and not hurt anybody and get away with it. And you know, that monster needs to stay down there because it's not true. 1,000 people have claimed to be D.B. Cooper. Dozens have tried to copy him. They've all failed. You can't do that. It's only in the realm of fiction. And that's why I took his case and turned it into a referring novel. I think that's where that monster belongs, is in the realm of fiction.
So one final question about the TSA then, because you mentioned how they had tightened up security. So from 1971, in that 30-year period between Cooper and 9/11, did after 5 or 6 years the TSA sort of just get a little bit lax, and they had 20 years of, because I remember traveling. I wasn't on an airplane pre-Cooper, and even if I was, I wouldn't remember it. But I did travel in the early 90s on, and there was, you know, some security, but not anything like today. So what was that 30-year interim? Did security go up and then sort of slack off a little bit, or what?
No, the security was very effective. For that 30-year period, there were almost no hijackings. They just really shut it down. The 9/11 hijackers came up with a whole new twist: box cutters. You have a plastic box cutter with this tiny razor blade that doesn't show up on the scans, and they're not looking for it anyway, but you can still kill somebody with a box cutter. And so that's how they got around it. Now, they won't let you on with a box cutter or anything sharp. You bring a pocket knife to the airport, it goes into the trash bin. Now, Cooper did increase security, and they really solved that, and now have had to increase it again because of 9/11. But you see, that's the difference. The 9/11 hijackers were really evil. They killed thousands of people. They were willing to die themselves. They did blow up planes. Cooper didn't do any of that. He's sort of a relatable Jesse James, the relatable Robin Hood. And that's why it's okay, I think, to still admire the guy who got away and write a novel about it and still have some fun with that story.
And you mentioned the series. What's the next book in the series that's coming out, and when?
Well, I did. The first was a case of Einstein's violin, and each deal with a case, an actual case. There's then the case of D.B. Cooper's parachute. The parachute never shows up, but the case is critical. And then the case of the Reborn Bogwin. I'm working on the case of Ken Kesey's lost novel, and it's going to be a very strange one.
Yeah.
But again, I'm having some real fun with it. And Ken Kesey was another weird Oregon icon. That, yeah, she was also a very fun and strange character. So I thought maybe I could get a mystery out of that too.
Well, I will link to the D.B. Cooper's parachute book on Amazon, unless you want to send me a link.
No, that's fine.
And I want to thank you then for spending an hour talking about D.B. Cooper in real and in fiction.